The letter that gave Verity Carrick away came folded around a tide table, and the tide table was the only honest thing in it. She found the pair of them on her father's desk in the counting house at Lancaster, held down by a brass weight shaped like a ship's block, on a wet morning in November when the quay outside smelled of tar and rotten rope, and the river ran the color of weak tea. Her father was not there. Her father had gone out to the coffee house to be seen being calm, which was what Josiah Carrick did now instead of paying anybody. The letter was in his own hand, and it was addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Halstrand, and it had not yet been sealed. Verity read it standing up, with her bonnet still dripping onto the ledger. Your Grace will recall that in the winter of the great tide, your household took, in the widow and the grandchildren of Thomas Carrick, guide over the Halstrand Sands, and kept them at Ashenholt from Martinmas to Lady Day, and paid for the schooling of the elder of the two, and asked nothing. This house has never been able to answer that kindness in coin. It can answer it now in the only way left to it. My daughter Verity is 23, sound, sensible, and of no expectation whatever. She is offered to your Grace in full settlement of the obligation, to be disposed of as your Grace sees fit. There was a good deal more of it. There was a paragraph about the fidelity, which had gone down off the point with £1,100 of her father's credit in her hold, and a paragraph about Charlotte, who was to marry the wine merchant at Preston in the spring, and could not possibly be spared, and a line at the end thanking the Duke in advance for his discretion, as though discretion were a thing you could order like coal. And underneath the letter, weighted flat, was the tide table for the Halstrand Sands, with the crossing hours for the 2nd week of November marked in pencil. Somebody had already worked out when she could be delivered. Verity stood in the cold counting house and read the letter twice, and the second time she read it, she noticed that her father had spelled her name correctly, which he did not always do, and that he had written the elder of the two rather than her name at all, and that the schooling he mentioned had been hers. 4 years of it. 2 winters of French and a great deal of arithmetic, paid for by a house they had all been taught to hate. That was the shape of the debt in the Carrick family. The Duke of Halstrand's people had let their grandfather drown, and then had fed them all winter, and nobody had ever forgiven them for either. She folded the letter along its own crease, and put it back under the brass weight, exactly as she had found it, because there was no sense in a scene. Then she took the tide table with her. Her father came home at 4, and found her sitting by the parlour fire, with the tide table open on her knee and a pencil in her hand, and he stopped in the doorway with his hat still on. You have been in my desk, he said. You left it on top of your desk, said Verity, under the block, where you leave things you want found. Josiah Carrick had been a handsome man once, in the way that a ship is handsome before the worm gets into it. He took off his hat and turned it round in his hands and said, It is a very great match. Better than anything I could have got you here. It is not a match. It is a payment. It is a settlement, he said, and the word came out of him quickly, the way a rehearsed word does. A settlement is an honourable thing. Half the marriages in this county are settlements. Half the marriages in this county are settlements where both parties have agreed. Has he agreed? Her father looked at the fire. You have not written to him yet, said Verity. You wrote the letter, and you have been sitting on it for a fortnight, because you know exactly what it is. "He will not refuse," said her father. "Nobody has called on that man in 11 years. Nobody will sit at his table. His own cousin has been trying to have him declared unfit these 3 years. He is not going to refuse a Carrick." He put his hat down on the sideboard. "And whatever you think of me, Verity, I would not send you to a cruel man. He is not cruel. He is only ruined and burnt and hated. And the burning was his own doing. And the hating is the county's, and neither of them has anything to do with you. Grandfather died on his father's sands." "Yes," said Josiah Carrick. "And his father is 11 years dead, and the sun took us in when the water was still in the parlour, and I have been ashamed of both facts every day since, and I have run out of ways to live with them. Go and be a duchess. Send us nothing. I do not want anything from him. I only want the account closed." It was, Verity thought afterwards, the single truest thing her father ever said to her, and he said it with his back to her, looking at a fire that needed coal. She was sent 8 days later. There was no carriage from Ashenholt. There was a reply, which came on the 3rd day and consisted of 2 sentences in a hard, slanted hand, and which her father would not let her read. And then there was a carter called Matishaw, who was paid to bring her over the sands with her box, because the road round the head of the bay was 41 miles, and cut in the middle by the works at Skelbeck, where they were building a new bridge and had thrown a dam across the beck and turned the whole road to soup. Everybody said the sands were the quick way. Everybody had always said that. The sands were 7 miles across at low water and 41 miles round, and for 400 years the market carts and the drovers and the fishwomen and the parson had all gone straight over the wet, in the 2.5 hours the tide allowed them, following a line of laurel branches stuck upright in the sand by a man paid to know where the channels were. There had been a man paid to know. His name had been Thomas Carrick, and he had been Verity's grandfather, and there had been nobody paid to know since the night he died. They went down onto the sands at 9:30 in the morning, with the light coming flat and silver off 7 miles of wet, and Verity, sitting up on the cart beside Matishaw, with her box behind her, and her boots already soaked, felt the whole of her chest go loose and strange, the way it does when you come back to a room you were happy in as a child. She had been 11 years off the sands. She had not forgotten one thing about them. She knew the smell, which was not the sea and not the river, but the thing between them, cold and mineral and faintly like iron. She knew the way the wet sand rang under the wheels, and then stopped ringing when you came onto the soft. She knew that the ripples run one way where the ground is hard, and the other way where it is not, and that you never trust a flat place, and that the water in a good channel is brown, and the water in a bad one is grey, and moving too smoothly, as though something under it were pulling. And about 1.5 miles out, where the first line of laurel came into view, she knew that they were going to die. "Stop the horse," she said. Matishaw did not stop the horse. Matishaw was a Skelbeck man who had crossed the sands 11 times in his life, and thought that made him a sandsman, and he had a duchess to deliver and a tide behind him. "Stop the horse," said Verity again, and stood up on the footboard, and took the reins out of his hands. The laurel branches were beautiful. They stood in a long, shallow curve away to the southwest, 30 yards apart, freshly cut, the leaves still green enough to show against all that grey. They marked a road, as plainly as milestones, and they were planted in the old channel. The channel that had run there when Verity was 12 years old, and the water had left that channel years ago and gone north, and the pretty green line of them ran straight out over a mile of ground that would take a horse to the shoulder in about 9 seconds. "Those are wrong," she said. "Those are the marks. Those are last year's marks in a channel that moved." She was already turning the horse, and the horse, which had more sense than either of them, turned willingly. "Look at the water. Look at where it is standing, not where the branches are. It is standing north of them. The channel has gone north, and somebody has put the laurel out on the memory of it." "Then what do we follow?" "Nothing," said Verity Carrick. "We go north until I can hear it." There is a thing her grandfather had taught her that she had never once said out loud to another living creature, because it sounded like madness, and because he had made her promise not to. He used to make her get down off the cart and put her hands flat on the sand and hold still. "The sand talks," he said, "not the water. The water lies to you. The water is only weather. The sand tells you what is under it. Hard ground rings, soft ground hums, and a channel that has moved in the night makes a sound like somebody breathing in the next room, and once you have heard it, you will never mistake it for anything else again." She got down off the cart in 3 inches of water, with her skirts round her knees, and put her hands flat on the sand, and Matishaw said something about her being mad, and she did not hear him. There, away to the north. Breathing, they followed her hands for 2 miles. She walked in front of the horse the whole way with her skirt gathered up in one fist and a stick out of the cart in the other, sounding the ground in front of her at every 3rd step the way she had watched an old man do it when she was small, and behind her Matishaw stopped talking, and then stopped whistling, and then began, without being asked, to lead the horse. They came off the sands at Ashenholt Slip at 11 minutes past 12, and behind them the flood came up the new channel in a low brown line, moving faster than a man can walk, exactly where the pretty green laurel branches stood in a row. Verity turned and watched it go over them. It took them one at a time, like a hand closing. "Somebody planted those," she said. "Somebody cut fresh laurel and went out and planted them in a dead road, and every one of them cost a shilling of labour, and no man alive who knew this crossing would have put a single one of them where they are." Matishaw said nothing at all. He had gone a bad colour. "How many carts a week come over?" "Market days, 20, 30 in a good week." He wiped his mouth. "Drovers more, in the back end of the year. Cattle from over the water, 200-300 head some weeks." "Then somebody is going to be drowned before the new moon," said Verity. "And it will be a great many somebodies. And it will be nobody's fault, because there is nobody whose fault it is allowed to be." She looked up the slip. Above it, on the rise, standing out of a black wood with the sea light behind it, was Ashenholt. It was not what she had been told. She had been told a ruin. It was not a ruin. It was worse than a ruin, because it was perfectly sound and perfectly kept, and 3 quarters shut, and you could see which quarter was alive by the chimneys. Out of 11 chimneys, 2 were smoking. The rest stood there in the clean, cold air, doing nothing whatever, and every window in the west front was shuttered from the inside, and the shutters were painted, and the paint was new. Somebody was maintaining the closing of that house. Somebody was going out every few years and repainting the shutters they never opened. There was a man standing at the top of the slip, with a lantern in his hand, unlit at midday. He did not come down. He waited until the cart was up and level with him, and the horse had stopped blowing. And then he looked at the sands behind her, and at the brown line of the flood standing where the laurel had been, and last of all at her. "You came north of the marks," he said. "The marks are in the old channel. I know where the marks are." His voice was low and flat, and entirely without hospitality. "I am asking how you knew." Verity Carrick got down off the cart. She was wet to the waist. Her hem had gone the colour of the sands, and there was sand-dried grey on the backs of her hands and, she discovered later, in a fan across her left cheek, where she had pushed her hair out of her eyes. Her bonnet was ruined. She had crossed 7 miles of the Halstrand on foot in November to be married, and she was well aware, like something the tide had left. She looked up at him anyway, because she had been brought up to look at people. He was perhaps 32, black coat, no overcoat, in that wind, tall and standing very straight, and holding the lantern in his right hand only, because his left was gloved and hung at his side, and did not move at all. And down the left side of his face, from the corner of the eye to the jaw and on down under his collar, the skin was burnt. It was old. That was the thing she noticed, and never afterwards stopped noticing. It was long healed, years and years healed, gone smooth and pale and slightly bright, the way old burns go, so that the light sat on it differently from the rest of him. The eye on that side was clear and undamaged, and very grey. The mouth on that side pulled a little when he spoke. It was not horrible. It was not anything like what she had been promised in 11 years of a Lancaster parlour. It was simply a man who had been in a fire a long time ago, and had gone on with it. She had been told he would look away. He did not look away. He stood there and let her look, with the flat, patient expression of a man who has decided that the first 10 seconds are always the same and the only thing to do is get them over. "My grandfather taught me," she said. "Thomas Carrick." The lantern in his right hand went down slowly until the base of it rested on the wall beside him. "Say that again," he said. "Thomas Carrick was my grandfather. I used to come out with him on the cart when I was small. I am Verity Carrick, and my father has written to you, and I understand that you have already replied, and that nobody has thought it necessary to tell me what you said." There was a silence that went on long enough for her to hear the water working at the bottom of the slip. "I said no," said the Duke of Halstrand. "Then why are you standing at the top of the slip at midday with a lantern?" "Because the tide table said a cart would be crossing," he said, "and because for the last 11 years, when a cart is crossing, I stand here." He turned his head and looked out at the water. "Come inside, Miss Carrick. You are going to be ill." The hall of Ashenholt was warmer than the outside, and that was the whole of what could be said for it. Everything in it was covered. There was a housekeeper called Mrs. Ibbotson, a broad, red, unsurprised woman of 60, who took one look at Verity's hem and said, "Kitchen," in the tone of a woman conceding a long argument to nobody in particular. And there was a steward, called Rook, thin and grey and about 100, who stood in the doorway of a room full of shrouded furniture and watched her go past with an expression she could not read at all. They gave her dry clothes that had belonged to somebody dead, and a bowl of broth in the kitchen, which was the warm room, and which was clearly where everybody in that house actually lived. And an hour later, Mrs. Ibbotson came and said his Grace would speak with her, and took her along a passage to a small square room with a fire, and a great many books lying open face down, and no dust on anything, and one window looking straight out at 7 miles of wet. He was standing at the window with his back to her. "Your father's letter," he said, "is the most disgraceful document I have ever received, and I have received a summons from my own cousin, asking a court to say I am not fit to hold my own name." He turned round. "You are not a payment, Miss Carrick. There is no debt. A man does not run an account for feeding people in a bad winter. I would have written that to your father if I had thought he could read it. He can read it. He would simply prefer not to. Then let me be plainer." He came away from the window. "I have money. Not much of it, but enough. I will send you back over the sands tomorrow at the top of the water with £40 and a letter saying the obligation is discharged, closed, and never to be mentioned again, and you may go home and marry whom you like, and nobody in this county will ever know you stood in this room." "And go home to what?" said Verity. "To your family. My family have just sent me across the Halstrand in November as a parcel," she said. "There is no home to go back to. There is a house at Lancaster with the bailiff's men sitting in the front parlour, eating my father's cheese, and a sister who is very sorry and will marry her wine merchant in April, and a bedroom that has already been let to a clerk from the customs house. My father did not send me here to settle a debt, Your Grace. He sent me here because he could not feed me." The Duke of Halstrand stood quite still and absorbed that, and Verity watched him do it, and understood that whatever else was wrong with the man, he did not flinch from a plain fact any more than he flinched from being looked at. "Then I will settle an income on you," he said, "and you will live where you choose, and we need never see one another again. You will settle an income on a woman you are not married to, in a county that already calls you a murderer," said Verity. "Think for one moment what they will make of that. I would be your kept woman by Christmas in every parlour between here and Kendal, and so would every woman who ever came to this house afterwards for help, and you would never be able to give anybody anything again as long as you lived." He said nothing. "You have thought of that already," she said. "I have thought of very little else since your father's letter came." He put his gloved hand flat on the back of a chair. "Which is why the answer was no. Then let me give you a different answer." Verity Carrick stood up. Her borrowed sleeves were too long, and her hair was still damp, and she knew, 23 years old and nobody at all, and she had spent the last 2 hours in a warm kitchen listening to a housekeeper and a boot boy talk, and she had learned more in those 2 hours than her father had learned in 11 years. "There has been no guide over the Halstrand Sands since my grandfather drowned. Nobody has been paid to walk the channels, and nobody has been paid to cut the laurel, and yet the laurel is cut, and the laurel is planted, and it is planted badly, and 30 carts a week are following it. Somebody is doing it out of conscience and doing it wrong. Today it nearly killed me. In 3 weeks it will kill a drove. Miss Carrick, I can read that crossing," she said. "I am probably the only person left alive who can, and I did not learn it out of a book. I learned it walking behind an old man for 9 years with my hands on the ground, and I have no name, no money, no expectations, and no character to lose, and you have a name so bad that mine cannot possibly injure it further. So here is my answer. Marry me. Not because you owe my father anything, and not because you feel sorry for me, and I would be obliged if you would never again offer me £40. Marry me because a duchess may walk the sands, and a hired woman may not. And because if I am to make 30 carters and 200 drovers take their line from a woman, I will need to be somebody they cannot refuse. He looked at her for a long moment. That is a very cold arrangement, he said. It is a great deal warmer than the one my father proposed. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was too tired and too surprised to be a smile. But it was the first movement she had seen in that face that had not been put there on purpose. You would have the West Channel to walk in January, he said. You understand what that is. I understand exactly what that is. Do you? Yes, said the Duke of Halstrand. I have been walking it since I was 19 years old. She did not at the time understand what he had just told her. That is the thing about the truth. It is very rarely withheld. It is simply said early, in an ordinary voice, at a moment when you are thinking about something else. They were married 11 days later in the chapel at Ashenholt, which held about 40 people and contained 6. Mrs. Ibbotson stood up with her. Rook gave her away, in a coat that had been brushed so hard the nap was gone. There were 2 housemaids at the back, Alice Prue and a girl from Kirkgarth, and there was Mattie Shaw the carter, who had refused to go home, and who had spent 11 days telling the whole of the far shore about a woman who put her hands on the sand. The vicar of Halstrand parish did not come. He sent his curate, Mr. Loveday, a mild, anxious young man who kept his eyes on his book and read the service very fast, and who could not be persuaded afterwards to stay for anything to eat. The bell rang. That was the one thing about the day that Verity kept. There is a bell in the chapel tower at Ashenholt that is not a church bell. It is a tide bell. It was hung 400 years ago by whichever Vaudrey it was who first held that land, and the terms he held it on were not written down in any court, but were known by everybody on both shores. That the house above the crossing should keep the crossing. That it should feed and lodge any traveller the water caught. That it should light the far bank and cut the marks and ring the bell at the turn of the tide, every tide, forever, and take nothing for it. It is not a law. There is no paper. There is no penalty. It is only hospitality, which is the oldest and the most binding obligation there is, and the only one nobody can ever be sued for breaking. They rang it for her wedding, and it rang out flat and brown over 7 miles of wet, and on the far shore at Kirkgarth people stopped what they were doing and looked across. Because the Halstrand bell had not been rung for a happy reason in 11 years. And if you are listening to this from somewhere the tide never reaches, stay with me and subscribe, because everything the county believed about Gabriel Vaudrey was wrong, and I am going to show you exactly how wrong, and exactly what it cost him to let them believe it. Her wedding night was a fire, a supper tray, and a door that nobody opened. She had expected that, and had told herself she had expected it, and was surprised by how thoroughly she disliked it anyway. She was put in the east wing, in a bedroom with new sheets and a fire built up too high by somebody who had guessed wrong about how cold she would be, and a jug of hot water, and on the table beside the bed 3 books, chosen by a person who did not know her at all and had tried very hard. There was a book of sermons, which was a guess at what a respectable woman wanted. There was a novel, which was a guess at what a young one wanted. And there was a bound survey of the tidal harbours of the north-west coast, with a great many folded plans in it, and that one had been read to pieces by somebody else long before it was ever put beside her bed. She read the third one until 2 a.m. That was the first week. In the second week, she began to notice the house. Ashenholt was not a cold house. That was the strangest thing about it. It was a shut house being run by 4 people who behaved, in the 2 rooms they used, like the staff of somewhere thriving. The kitchen fire was never out. There was always bread. Mrs. Ibbotson did the accounts on a slate on the dresser, and did them honestly and out loud. Rook went round the shut rooms once a week, and opened and closed the shutters in a fixed order so the paint would not seize. And things happened to Verity that nobody would admit to. Her chair at breakfast moved. On the first morning it was at the far end of the table, at the correct and freezing distance from the head of it. On the 4th morning it was on the other side, at the corner, next to the fire, and nobody said anything, and when she looked at Mrs. Ibbotson looked at the ceiling. A pair of men's sea boots appeared outside her door, cleaned with the salt taken off, in a size that was not a man's size at all, but hers, because somebody had gone and measured the boots she had ruined on the crossing. A tide table appeared pinned inside the kitchen door, in a hard slanted hand, worked out to the minute for the whole of December, with the 2 spring tides underlined twice. And on the 8th morning she came down at 6, and found that a lamp had been left burning at the foot of the back stairs, where nobody had any business being at 6 in the morning, except a woman going out onto the sands, and beside the lamp a stick, not a walking stick, an ash pole, 7 feet of it, worn smooth in 2 places by 2 different hands, with a brass ferrule on the end. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, and beautifully balanced, and about 18 inches from the top. Cut deep into the wood and blacked with age, there was a row of small square notches. She counted them. There were 11. She stood there in the cold passage at 6 in the morning, holding her grandfather's staff, and could not, for a while, make her hands do anything at all. She did not ask him about the staff. She had learned already that if you asked Gabriel Vaudrey a direct question about himself, he answered it with perfect honesty and told you nothing, the way a man pays a bill exactly and leaves no tip. So she took the staff out onto the sands instead, and used it, and let him watch her from the top of the slip, which he did every morning with the unlit lantern in his hand. November went out. She walked the crossing 31 times in 22 days. This is what that work is, since almost nobody now alive has seen it done. Twice a day the water goes off 7 miles of the Halstrand and leaves it as flat and open as a market square, and twice a day it comes back, and it comes back at a running walk, and it comes back up the channels first, so that the danger is never the water in front of you, but the water already behind you. Between the 2 shores there are 3 channels, and they are not where they were last year, and after any heavy rain in the hills they are not where they were last week. The Skell comes down out of the fells and cuts a new bed for itself in one night, and leaves the old one to fill with soft ground, and soft ground on the Halstrand is not a metaphor. A horse goes in, to the knee, and then to the hock, and then it is over. The guide's work was to walk it. All of it. Every low water, in every weather, sounding ahead with the pole, finding where the hard bottom ran, and then going back at the next low water with an armful of laurel branches cut green, because green wood shows against wet sand for 8 days, and dead wood shows for 2, and planting them 30 yards apart along the line the carts must take, and pulling out yesterday's when they were wrong, and standing on the shore on market mornings to say yes or no, and ringing the bell. There is a wooden dial in the base of the Ashenholt tower, and a rope, and the thing Verity found she loved best in her first month of marriage was the sound of that bell going out across the water at the turn and the answering rattle of 40 cartwheels on the far slip as the whole of Kirkgarth Market started to move at once because a bell told them they had 2 hours and 11 minutes. She rang it herself, the first time, on the 9th of December. Rook came into the tower to see who was doing it. He stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back and watched her haul, and when the peal was finished he said, "Thomas Carrick used to ring it in 3s. I know. You are ringing it in 3s. I know, Mr. Rook." The old man's face did something complicated. "It is a good sound," he said, and went away. The county did not call. Verity had known they would not, in the abstract, and discovered in the particular that she minded. Nobody came. Not the Prestwicks at Beckfoot, not the Ambleys, not old Lady Skelwith, who called on everyone. There were no cards. There were twice invitations addressed to the Duke of Halstrand alone, both of which were the sort that are sent in the certainty of refusal, so that the sender may say afterwards that they did ask him. Mrs. Ibbotson explained it in the kitchen, chopping. They came for a while. After, she said. First year or so. Curiosity, mostly. Then it settled into what it is now, which is that they have all agreed on a story, and the story is very comfortable, and if any of them came here and sat down and looked at him, they might have to stop telling it. And what is the story? Mrs. Ibbotson stopped chopping. That the old Duke's son let 11 people go into the water on a flood tide because the family had stopped paying the guide, and that he was seen out on the sands that night with a fire, and that he did nothing, she said. That is the story, Your Grace. I have heard it from a bishop. And is it true? You must ask him, said Mrs. Ibbotson, and began chopping again hard. The one person who did call was his cousin. Mr. Julian Vaudrey came on the 12th of December, in a chaise round by the road, which took him 4 hours and which he mentioned 9 times. He was a handsome, pink, pleasant man of about 40, with very good boots, and the manner of somebody who has decided in advance to be charmed. And he kissed Verity's hand in the hall, and said, "But she is delightful," to nobody, as though she were a room that had been redecorated. They gave him tea in the one warm parlour. He looked at the shrouded furniture on the way past with the frank interest of a man pricing it. "You will have heard about my bridge," he said. "I have seen your dam," said Verity. "It has put the round road under 2 feet of water at Skelbeck. Temporarily, one cannot make an omelette." He smiled at her over the cup. 3 arches, stone, with a toll house at the Kirkgarth end, and by next Michaelmas a man will be able to take a loaded wagon from Lancaster to Kirkgarth without once putting a wheel on that appalling beach. Do you know what the subscription list looks like? Every mill in the valley. Every one. And the crossing? The crossing, said Julian Vaudrey, is a superstition with a body count. He said it lightly and pleasantly, and put his cup down, and went on saying it for a quarter of an hour, that the Sands had killed 140 people in living memory, which was true, and that a family which had held 400 acres on a promise to keep a crossing safe, and had let 11 people drown in one night, had rather forfeited the right to be sentimental about it. That last one he said directly to Gabriel, who had come in and had not sat down. "You have made that speech before," said Gabriel. "I have made it to the subscribers and to the Turnpike Trust, and I shall make it in London in February," said his cousin comfortably. "And I shall keep making it, Halstrand, because it is true, and because the moment that beach is shut and the road is turned, this house has no purpose whatever, and no obligation, and no reason to hold 400 acres of the best foreshore in the north on a nod from the 15th century. I would rather it came to me by consent than by a physician's opinion. I have said so before. I say it again in front of your wife." Verity set down the teapot. "Miss Vaudrey," she said, "did you cut the laurel?" There was a pause of exactly the wrong length. "I beg your pardon?" "Somebody has been cutting fresh laurel and planting it in the old channel," said Verity. 30 yards apart, all the way out, in a road that has been under moving water for 3 years. It is expensive work. It is 2 days for 2 men. And it is done by somebody who has seen it done and does not understand it, because the branches are cut with a saw. And what does that signify? It signifies that they were not cut by a sandsman, she said. A hook leaves a slant. A saw leaves a square. Every laurel branch on that crossing has a square end. Mr. Vaudrey, my grandfather never owned a saw in his life. Julian Vaudrey laughed. It was a good laugh, easy and open, and it went on a little too long, and he looked at his cousin while he did it. "Halstrand," he said, "your wife has been reading novels." "My wife," said Gabriel Vaudrey, "walked north of those marks on a making tide in November, and brought a cart in 9 minutes ahead of the flood, and I watched her do it from the slip, and I have not slept properly since. Ask her about novels again, and you will go home in the dark." Julian Vaudrey went home at 3 by the road and was very charming about it, and shook his cousin's hand at the door and said something to Verity about the pleasure of finding spirit in a quiet house. When the chaise was gone, Gabriel stood in the hall with his back to her for a while. "I should not have said that," he said. "About not sleeping. Why not? Because he will use it. He collects things. He has been collecting things about me for 3 years." He turned round. "There is a physician at Kendal who has never met me, and who has twice signed a paper saying I am not competent to manage my affairs. My cousin pays him. It has come to nothing so far because a man cannot be shut up for being disliked. But every time I am strange in front of a witness, it is put in the pile. And what does strange mean?" "It means going out on the sands at night," said Gabriel Vaudrey, "which I do." That was the 11th of December. She let it lie for 4 days, because she had learned that with him a fact set down was a door left ajar, and if you pushed it, he shut it, and if you waited, he opened it a little wider himself. In those 4 days the weather turned soft and thick, and the crossing was unusable, and Ashenholt went quiet. And Verity discovered what her husband was like when there was nothing to do. He was, it turned out, almost intolerably restless and completely silent about it. He mended things. He had a bench in the old brewhouse, and a good set of tools, and he mended everything in that house that could be mended, badly at first and then over 11 years extremely well, and what he mended chiefly was poles. There were 19 of them racked in the brewhouse, ash and hazel, in every length, all of them shaped and burnt smooth and ferruled, and a bundle of laurel hooks with the edges kept like razors, and a box of brass ferrules he had cast himself out of old candlesticks. "You made all these," she said. "There is nothing else to make. You could have made 19 chairs." "Nobody sits here," said Gabriel, and then heard himself, and laughed. It was a short, rusty, unpracticed sound, and it stopped almost at once, and he looked genuinely startled by it, and Verity turned away and put her hands in the laurel bundle so that he would not see her face. That was the night she asked about the glove. They ate in the kitchen now. That had been Mrs. Ibbotson's doing, or possibly Verity's, or possibly nobody's. The dining room was shrouded, and 30 feet long, and the kitchen had a fire. And by the middle of December, there was simply a table with 2 places at the warm end of it, and an argument every evening about whether the Duke of Halstrand was permitted to carry his own plate. He ate left-handed things right-handed. She had watched him do it for a month. Bread torn against the edge of the plate, meat cut with the fork laid down and taken up again, the glove staying where it was. "Does it hurt?" she said. Nobody in 11 years had asked him that. She saw the whole of it go across his face. "No," he said. "It has not hurt for 9 years. It does not open past this far." He showed her, with the glove still on, the hand closing about 1/3 of the way. The 2 smallest fingers do nothing at all. It is not painful. It is only ugly, and it is quicker to wear the glove than to watch a housemaid be brave about it. "I am not a housemaid." "No," he agreed. "Then take it off." He looked at her for a long moment across a kitchen table with a candle between them, and Verity Carrick discovered that her heart was going much too fast for a woman making a reasonable request. He took it off. The hand was worse than the face. She had expected that, and it was still worse than she expected, the whole back of it, and the wrist, and the 2 outer fingers drawn in and welded together at the base by a broad pale ridge of old scarring, smooth and hard and shining, the way skin goes when it has healed under a tight bandage for a year. It was a hand that had been in a fire and had been dragged out of it. She did not do the thing she had planned, which was to say something calm. She put out her own hand and turned his over and looked at the palm, which was untouched and ordinary and calloused across the base of the fingers exactly as her grandfather's had been, and she said, "You have a pole hand." "What?" There she ran her thumb along it. "That is not from mending. That is 9 winters of a wet ash pole. Grandfather had one just the same, and he used to say it was the only honest thing about him." She looked up. "How long have you been keeping the crossing?" Gabriel Vaudrey did not take his hand back. "Since I was 19, he said. "How long have you been cutting the laurel?" "I do not cut the laurel," he said. "That is the point, Verity. That is what I have been trying to tell you for a month and cannot say in the right order. Somebody else has been cutting the laurel since Michaelmas, and I do not know who, and every branch of it is in the wrong place. And I go out and I pull them, and by the next low water there are more." She went out at 4 the next morning. She did not tell him. That was, she admitted afterwards, the one genuinely underhanded thing she did that winter, and she did it because she had spent 4 days deciding that the man was protecting somebody and would go on protecting them until it killed a drove of cattle and a family from Kirkgarth. The tide was at its bottom, at 5:20. It was black, dark, and hard frost, and the sand was white with it, ringing like a road under her boots, and there was a moon 3 days off the full, going in and out of cloud. She took the staff, and no light at all, because a light on the sands can be seen for 4 miles, and she wanted to see and not be seen. She went out along the true line, which she had planted herself with hazel wands, because there was no laurel left she trusted, and she lay down behind the low ridge of a cockle bank, about 1.5 miles out, in the frost, and she waited. At 5:10 she heard a hook going into green wood. He was 200 yards north of her, and he had a lantern, hooded down to a slit, so that it threw a stripe of light on the ground at his feet, and nothing upward at all, which is what a man does when he does not want the shore to see him. And he was working along the true channel, alone, in the dark, on a falling tide in December, planting laurel. Verity got up out of the frost and walked at him, and he heard her at 40 yards and lifted the lantern, and the slit of light came round and found her. "You," she said, "go back. You have been out here every low water for 11 years. Not every one." He had a bundle of laurel under his bad arm, held in the crook of it, cut green, and the cut ends were slanted. Hook cuts. I miss the 2 o'clocks in the summer. Verity, go back. The water comes up this bank first. I know how the water comes up this bank, she said. You are planting the true line. Somebody has to. Then who is planting the false one? And Gabriel Vaudrey, standing in the middle of 7 miles of frozen sand at 5:10 in the morning, with a hooded lantern and an armful of laurel, said, I have known for 3 weeks. I have been out here every low water for 3 weeks, pulling it up and putting the right line back, and I cannot pull it up faster than they can plant it. He has 4 men and a cart and money, and I have this. Say the name. You said it to his face at my tea table, said Gabriel. And he laughed, and I have not slept since. They came in off the sands at 6:30, with the flood behind them, and they did not go up to the house. They went into the tower, because it was the nearest door, and because there was a brazier in the base of it, and a bench. And he lit the brazier, and they sat on the bench. And he told her, at last, with the bell rope hanging between them and the water coming up outside, what had happened on the night the tide took 11 people. My father stopped the guide's money in the June, he said. It was £30 a year and a house. There was no reason for it, except that he had lost a great deal at Lancaster, and he had begun to economize on things that did not show. He economized on the laurel first. Laurel is bought by the cartload from the Beckfoot woods, and it is a shilling a load, and he stopped that in the July, and your grandfather went on cutting it out of the hedges at his own charge, and did not tell anybody, and I did not know. You were 19. I was 19, and I was at home, and I had eyes, he said. Do not make that excuse for me. Nobody has ever made it, and I would not know what to do with it. He put another 2 pieces of wood on the brazier. In the October the Skell came down in flood, and shifted the west channel 1/4 mile north in one night. Thomas Carrick walked it 3 times, and came up to this house on the Tuesday and stood in the hall, and said the crossing was to be shut for a fortnight until he could recut it. And my father said no, because it was the back end of the year, because the Kirkgarth Beast Fair was on the Thursday, and there were 400 head to come over, and every one of them paying a penny at the slip. Gabriel looked at the fire, and because there was a wager, my father had bet Sir Harry Prestwick 80 guineas that the Lancaster mail could be taken over the Halstrand in under 2 hours, and Prestwick was at our table that night, and it was a very good dinner, and I sat at it. Gabriel, your grandfather refused to walk in front of it, he said. He stood in that hall and he said, I will not take a coach over that ground, and my father said, then the crossing does not need you, and dismissed him at the door in front of a footman. And 2 hours later a coach and 4 went down onto the sands with a lamp on the box and no marks in front of it, and the beast fair carts followed it, because they always follow a coach. 11 people, a woman from Kirkgarth and her mother, 2 drovers, the guard off the mail, a man who was walking over to see about work, and grandfather. And your grandfather, said Gabriel, who was not there, who had been dismissed, who was sitting in his own kitchen 4 miles off, and who heard the horses and went out. The brazier cracked. Out beyond the tower door the flood came up the slip, with its small, busy noise. I rode down at about 9, he said. I do not want you to think I was heroic. I rode down because I was ashamed at a dinner table and could not sit still, and I got to the slip and there was already screaming out on the wet. And there is a thing you do, if there is nothing else, which is that you take the pitch brazier off its hook at the slip head, and you carry it out to the highest ground you can reach, and you hold it up, because a fire on the sand is the only bearing there is in the dark. So I took it out to the cockle bank, and I stood on the bank and I held it up. For how long? Until about 4 in the morning, he said. The pitch went over about midnight. You keep the pot swinging on a chain, and the chain burnt through on one side, and the whole of it came down my left arm and my face, and I put it out in the sand and picked it up again, because there was still noise out there. 7 people came in on that light. 7 of the 18. Your grandfather brought 2 of them to the bank himself and went back for the woman from Kirkgarth and got a rope on her, and she came in, and he did not. Verity found that she was holding the edge of the bench with both hands. They came looking for him at first light, said Gabriel, and they found me on the bank with the pot, and I could not speak, and there is a version of that morning in this county in which I was standing over the drowned with a fire in my hands and had been out there all night doing nothing. That version is 11 years old. It is in a bishop's letter. My cousin has a copy. Then tell them, said Verity. Tell them what your father did. No, you have let them call you a murderer for 11 years to protect a man he was ill by the spring and dead by the September, and he knew what he had done, said Gabriel Vaudrey. He never spoke of it once. Not once, Verity. Not to me, not to the coroner, not to God as far as I know. He simply stopped speaking. And I could have hanged his name up in front of the whole county, and I did not. And I have told myself for 11 years that it was mercy, and it was not mercy. It was cowardice of a particular kind. He turned his head and looked at her with the burnt side toward the fire, so that the light lay along it. Because if I say my father sent that coach out, then I have to say the rest of it. That I was at the table when the wager was made, that I heard Thomas Carrick refuse in that hall, and I said nothing, because I was 19, and my father was in a good humor for the first time in a month, and I did not want to spoil it. 2 hours, Verity. I had 2 hours and a horse, and I could have ridden down to the slip and turned that coach with one sentence, and I sat in a warm room and let a man I had known all my life be put out of the door like a servant. And so you have been walking the channels for 11 years. I have been paying, he said. It is not a virtue. It is a bill. Verity Carrick sat on a cold bench in a bell tower with the tide coming in, and looked at the man she had married 11 days after meeting him, and understood several things at once. She understood why the shutters were repainted. She understood why there were 19 poles in the brewhouse, and no chairs. She understood why a man who could barely be got to sit down at his own table had stood at the top of the slip at midday, with an unlit lantern in his hand, on the off chance that a cart he had refused to send for might come over anyway. And she understood that he had given her the staff. The pole, she said, with the notches. He kept it in the porch of the guide's house. I went and took it the week after, before they cleared the place, because I thought somebody ought to have it, and I did not think it should be sold. He was not looking at her. I cut the notches myself. That winter. One for each. It was a 19-year-old's idea of the right thing to do, and I have regretted it ever since, because now no one can carry it without carrying them. I have carried it every day for a month. I know. I have watched you do it from the slip, and I have thought every single morning that I should never have put it in your way. And every single morning I have gone on putting the lamp out at the foot of the stairs so that you would not fall. The flood was at the tower door now. It came up over the sill in a thin sheet and stopped, the way it does, and the whole crossing behind it was gone as though it had never been dry ground in the history of the world. You said your grandfather taught you a thing, said Gabriel, out on the slip, the first day. You said he taught you and you would not say what. The sand talks. Say it properly. So she told him. She told him about hard ground ringing and soft ground humming and the sound like somebody breathing in the next room, and she told him that her grandfather had made her promise never to say it aloud, because a guide who talks like a witch is a guide who is not believed, and Gabriel Vaudrey listened to the whole of it with his ruined hand open on his knee, and at the end of it, he said, quietly, he told me the same thing. On the bank. He came in with the second man, and he put his hands flat on the sand, and he said, listen for the breathing, and then he went back out. And that was how Verity learned that her grandfather's last act, before he went back into the water for a woman from Kirkgarth, had been to teach the crossing to a 19-year-old boy who was on fire. After that they worked the crossing together, and the county, which had had nothing to talk about for 11 years, was given a great deal. They were seen. That was the point, and it was Verity's doing. She would not let him go out in the dark any more. She made him go out at midday, at the bottom of the water, in front of everybody, with a bundle of laurel on his shoulder, and his wife walking the line ahead of him with an ash pole, and she made him do it on market days when the far slip at Kirkgarth was full of carts waiting on the bell. They will say I am parading you, he said. They will say a great many things, said Verity, and every one of them will be about a man who is out on the sand in the middle of the day where they can see him, and not about a man who was on the sand in the dark 11 years ago where they could not. By the end of December they had remarked the whole crossing in hazel and green laurel on the true line, and Verity had walked the West Channel 11 times and knew it to a yard, and the Kirkgarth carters had begun cautiously, in the way of people who do not wish to be the first, to take their line from a woman. Matishaw was the first, having told the story of the 9th of November in every alehouse on both shores until it had grown 2 heads. The cockle women were second, which mattered more. There are 40 of them working the banks below Kirkgarth, and they are out on the wet more hours than anybody alive. And when they began saying that the hazel was right and the laurel wrong, the drovers listened, because a drover will not take advice from a duke, but he will take it from a woman with a rake. And Julian Vaudrey's men went on planting. They planted at night now, and further out, and cleverly. They stopped putting the false line in the old channel, because that had been noticed. They began instead to put 3 or 4 false ones at the mouth of the true line, angled just enough to turn a cart 4 points south of where it should go, so that a man coming off the Kirkgarth slip in a hurry would take the wrong opening and not know it for 1.5 miles. On the 2nd of January, a cockle cart with 2 women and a horse went in at the mouth of the west channel, and the horse went to the shoulder in soft ground, and it was Verity who got them out, wading in with a rope and the pole, up to her chest in January water for 40 minutes, and it was Gabriel who took the horse's head and hauled with 1.5 hands, while the far slip watched. And the horse came out, and the women came out, and one of them, a widow called Betty Hodgson, sat down on the wet sand and cried, and would not let go of Gabriel's sleeve, and that was the first time in 11 years that anybody from Kirkgarth had touched him on purpose. That is what they will remember, said Verity that night. Not the marks. Her hands on your coat, in front of 200 people. They will remember that I could not lift a horse's head with one arm. Gabriel, I know, he said. I know what you are doing. You are rebuilding me in public like a wall. He was sitting on the kitchen floor by the fire with his boots off, which was a thing he had begun to do, and which Mrs. Ibbotson pretended not to see. You should know that it is working, and that I find it almost unbearable, and that I would rather you did not stop. They had been married 7 weeks. She had come to him as a payment, in a wet gown with sand on her face, and she had bargained for a crossing and got a house full of people who lit lamps for her, and somewhere in there, without either of them agreeing to it, the arrangement had stopped being an arrangement. It was the pole hand that did it. In the end. She had held it once in a kitchen and had not been able to stop. She sat down on the floor next to him and took the glove off herself, and he let her, and she put the ruined hand flat between both of hers and held it there. I want to say something, and I want to say it badly, he said. Then say it badly. You are not a payment, said Gabriel Vaudrey. You have never been a payment. I want you to hear me say it in this kitchen, and not in a letter, because your father's letter is in my desk, and I have read it 11 times, and every time I read it I want to burn this house down. You were not sent to me. You came north of the marks on a making tide, and you walked in. Whatever there is left of me, and it is not a great deal, and most of it is out on that sand, it is yours, and it was yours from the top of the slip. Then stop sleeping in the west wing, said Verity Carrick. He did. The thaw came on the 9th of January, and with it the trouble that was always going to come. It rained on the fells for 4 days, and the Skell came down brown, and the west channel moved again. Not a 1/4 of a mile this time, but 80 yards, which is worse, because 80 yards is close enough to look right. Verity walked it on the 12th, and recut the whole line in a day and a half, with Gabriel and Matishaw, and 2 of the cockle women, and came in at dusk, with her arms shaking. And on the 13th 3 things happened. The first was that the fever came to Kirkgarth. It had been in the low houses by the shore since Christmas, and it went through them that week like water through sand. And by the 13th there were 9 houses shut, and 2 people dead, and no physician. Because the Kirkgarth apothecary had gone to his sister at Ulverston, and the nearest doctor was Ferris at Beckfoot on the Ashenholt shore. The second was that the round road went. Julian Vaudrey's cofferdam at Skelbeck had been holding back a beck in flood for 11 weeks, and on the morning of the 13th it did what everybody except Julian Vaudrey had said it would do. It went out in one piece at about 4 in the morning, and took the temporary way with it, and left 140 yards of the turnpike as a gravel bed with 4 feet of brown water in it. No one was hurt. The bridge works stood. But the road round the head of the bay, the 41-mile road, the road that was going to make the crossing a superstition, was shut, and would be shut for a month, and the only way from one shore of the Halstrand to the other was 7 miles of wet sand. And the third thing was the drove. 260 head of cattle and about 30 people had been waiting at Kirkgarth since the 10th for the road or the weather, beasts bought at the winter fairs over the water, and bound for the Lancaster market on the 19th, with the drovers paying for feed they had not budgeted for, and losing money every hour they stood still. On the evening of the 13th, the head drover, a Galloway man called Corey, came across on the last of the water with Dr. Ferris's brother, and stood in the kitchen at Ashenholt with his hat in his hands. "They are saying at the Ferry Inn that the sands are shut," he said. "Vaudrey's man Sowerby has been in there 3 days, telling everybody the marks cannot be trusted, and the crossing is closed by order." "There is no order," I have asked. "Is it closed?" Verity looked at the tide table pinned inside the kitchen door. "Tomorrow," she said. "Low water at 4 minutes past 3. It is a spring tide, and it will make fast, and there is fog on the water tonight. And if the fog is still there in the morning, I will not take a drove across it." She looked at Gabriel. "And Dr. Ferris has to be at Kirkgarth by tomorrow evening, or there will be more than 2 dead in those houses." "Then it is not really a question," said Gabriel Vaudrey. The fog was still there in the morning. It lay on the whole bay in a flat white sheet about the height of a man, so that from the top of the slip you could see 7 miles of nothing at all, and, very faintly, the tops of the fells on the far side floating above it like an island. Verity stood at the slip head for 20 minutes and did the arithmetic. Low water at 4 minutes past 3. 2 hours and 50 minutes of usable ground, and no more, because it was 2 days past the full moon, and a spring tide on the Halstrand does not come in. It arrives. 7 miles over. 7 miles back. 260 cattle, which move at 2 miles an hour on wet sand and cannot be hurried, and 30 people, and a doctor going the other way, and a fog that would take her marks away at 40 yards. "It cannot be done twice," she said. "Over and back in one water, with beasts. It cannot be done." "Then it is done once," said Gabriel. "We go over now, before the bottom, with Ferris and every lantern in this house. We put Ferris on the Kirkgarth shore. We turn the drove at the bottom of the water, and we bring them back on the young flood. And we are wrong-footed the whole way, and we know it. And we do it anyway. Because the alternative is that 9 houses at Kirkgarth go on being shut, and those beasts stand on that shore, until the drovers are ruined, and the whole county says the crossing killed them without ever putting a foot on it. You have thought about this all night. I have thought about it for 11 years, he said. Verity, listen to me, because I will not be able to say it out there. The last mile is the West Channel, and the West Channel moved 80 yards on the 12th, and it is going to move again on this water, and in the fog nobody will find the opening. Not you, not me, not your grandfather. So I am not going to find it. I am going to stand in it. She had known he would say it. She had known since 4 o'clock that morning, lying awake with his ruined hand in both of hers. For how long? Until they are past. You will be in it on the flood. I will be in it on the flood, he agreed. And you will bring 260 head of cattle and 30 people past me at a walk. And you will not stop, and you will not turn round, and you will not send anybody back for me until the last beast is on the hard. Say it. I will not say it. Verity, I will not say it, said the Duchess of Halstrand, and you will have to go out there knowing that I am a liar, and that is the price of asking me. They went down onto the sands at 10 minutes past 1 with 11 lanterns, and behind them Mrs. Ibbotson and Alice Prue and Rook went up into the tower, and the arrangement was the oldest signal on that coast, and had not been used in living memory. The bell rung in threes, every 4 minutes, from the moment the first foot went on the wet until the last one came off. Sound carries over flat water in fog better than light does. It does not tell you where you are. It tells you where the shore is, which on the Halstrand is the only question. The crossing over took 80 minutes, and was the worst hour and a half of Verity Carrick's life until the return. She walked the whole of it in front, sounding, with Matishaw leading the doctor's horse behind her, and the fog closing at 40 yards, and the marks she had cut on the 12th coming up out of the white, one at a time like people stepping forward. Twice they were not there. Twice she stood still with her hands flat on the wet and made 11 men behind her stand still too, and listened for the breathing, and found it, and went on. They put Dr. Ferris on the Kirkgarth slip at 20 to 3, and did not stop for anything but water. The far shore was full, 260 cattle in the yards behind the Ferry Inn, and the drovers, and half of Kirkgarth out in the fog to watch, and standing at the top of the slip in a good coat with his hands behind his back, Mr. Sowerby. There is a notice, said Sowerby. By order of the Turnpike Trust, the crossing is not to be used until it is surveyed. The Turnpike Trust has no jurisdiction over 400 years of foreshore, and you know it, said Verity, because you are the man who wrote the notice. You will not get them across in the water that is left. I know exactly how much water is left, Misty, Sowerby, which is more than you have ever known about anything. She turned her back on him. Corey, bring them down, 4 abreast, no faster than the slowest, and the man at the back is to shout every 100 yards, so I know he is still there. Anybody who breaks out of the line, for any reason, whatever is to be left, beast or man, and I will come back for them at the next low water, and not before. And to the innkeeper's wife, who was standing at the door of the Ferry Inn with her apron in her hands, there is a beacon frame on the point above your yard, and there is pitch and there is wood in Sowerby's shed. And if that frame is not burning in 20 minutes, there will be 30 people out on that sand with no shore behind them. Sowerby has the shed key, said the innkeeper's wife. Then it is a very old shed, said Verity Carrick, and you are a very strong woman. The beacon was burning in 11 minutes. They came off the Kirkgarth slip at 3 minutes past 3, 1 minute before the bottom of the water, which is to say at the last possible moment that any sane person would have started, and they went out into the white. There is no describing the middle of it, and Verity never afterwards tried. 260 cattle on wet sand in fog make a sound like a river. Behind her the whole thing was invisible from the third rank back. There was Corey's voice, and the shout from the rear man every 100 yards, and the bell in threes out of the fog ahead every 4 minutes, going from a sound behind her to a sound in front of her at the halfway, which is the only navigation there was. The first 2 channels went well. They were where she had left them. At 25 past 4, with the light going and the fog gone the colour of dishwater, and the flood already running under the beast's feet an inch deep, an inch of moving water on 7 miles of flat sand, which is what the Halstrand looks like 11 minutes before it becomes impassable, Verity Carrick came to where the west channel ought to be, and found nothing at all. The line she had cut on the 12th was gone. Not moved. Gone 20 green wands pulled out of the ground and taken away, so that there was not a stick standing between her and the shore, and the channel had shifted again in the night, as he had said it would, and she stood in the last of the light with 260 cattle at her back, and the tide coming up her boots, and could not hear anything except a river of animals. "Stand them," she shouted. "Corey, stand them where they are," and out of the fog ahead of her, low down, close to the water, there was a light. It did not move. That was how she knew. Every other light on that coast moved, because every other light was carried by somebody sensible. This one was absolutely still, and it was low, far lower than a man's hand, and as she came up on it, at a run through 6 inches of water, she saw why, and she stopped, and something in her chest tore. Gabriel Vaudrey was standing in the west channel with the water at his chest, and the lantern lashed to the top of her grandfather's staff, and the staff held up over his head in both hands, the ruined one and the good one together, and he had been standing in it for 50 minutes. She did not stop. That was the one promise she kept, and it cost her more than anything she has done since. She went past him at 4 feet, close enough to see that his lips had gone the colour of the water, and she put her hand on the staff for 1 second, and then took it off, and she shouted his bearing back down the line, and 260 cattle and 30 people came past the Duke of Halstrand at a walk in the last of the light, one at a time, with the flood rising on him the whole way, and every single one of them saw his face. That is the thing the county never got over. Not the rescue, the 40 minutes of it. 30 people who had been told a story about a man standing over the drowned with a fire in his hands walked past that man in 6 inches of water, while he stood in a channel, holding a light up so that they would not die, and not one of them could ever be told the story again. The last beast came on to the hard at 11 minutes past 5. Verity went back with Corey and Matishaw and 40 feet of rope and the flood at their waists, and they got a bite of it round him under the arms, and he could not let go of the staff, because his hands had shut on it and would not open. And in the end they brought the 2 of them in together, the man and the pole, and laid him on the slip in the dark, with the whole of Kirkgarth Market's drove standing round in the fog. He was 3 days in a fever, and Dr. Ferris was on the wrong side of the water for 2 of them. And Mrs. Ibbotson and Verity kept him in the kitchen by the fire, because it was the warm room, and on the fourth morning he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, "How many?" "None," said Verity. 260 beasts, 31 people, 1 doctor, and a horse with a cut hock. "None, Gabriel." He shut his eyes again and did not say anything for a long time. She thought he had gone back to sleep. Then he said, "Get the staff." She got it. He turned it over on the blanket with both hands until he found the row of notches, and he ran his thumb along them, all 11, and then stopped at the end of the row where there was nothing. "Good," he said. What broke Julian Vaudrey was a piece of wood 11 inches long. Verity had gone out at the next low water and walked the last mile of the west channel and picked up 4 of the pulled wands off a cockle bank where the flood had stranded them, and she brought them up to the Ferry Inn on the Saturday and put them on the table in front of Corey and the drovers and the cockle women and about 60 other people. And she did not make a speech. She simply turned the ends up. Sawn, every one of them square and every one of them cut off at the base by the same saw that had cut the false laurel in November, and a drover knows a sawn end from a hook end the way a farmer knows his own gate. There was no court in it, and no hearing, and no lawyer, and that was exactly why it worked. The Halstrand crossing does not belong to a trust. It belongs to the people who walk on it. By the Monday, every drover on both shores knew that somebody had pulled the marks in front of 260 head of cattle in a fog, and by the Wednesday Mr. Sowerby had left Kirkgarth on the first boat and was not seen again, and by the end of the month 11 of the 14 mills had taken their names off the bridge subscription, not because anything was proved, but because no mill in Lancashire wanted its name on a list next to a man whose agent had done that. Julian Vaudrey went to London in February and did not make his speech. The physician at Kendal returned his fee. The 3 arches stand to this day at Skelbeck, half built with grass in them, and the county calls it Vaudrey's Folly, and nobody has ever quite been able to say aloud what it was he did. The county called it Ashenholt in the spring. They came slowly, and with a good deal of nonsense about having been meaning to for ages. Lady Skelwith came first and pretended she had never believed a word. Sir Harry Prestwick, who had made a wager at a dinner table 11 years before, did not come at all, and sent instead a bank order for £200 toward the guide's house with no letter in it, which Verity thought was the only honest thing anybody did that year. But the thing that mattered happened before any of them, on a Sunday in the last week of January, in the churchyard at Halstrand, when Betty Hodgson and 4 other women from Kirkgarth walked up out of the fog with the old pitch brazier off the slip head carried between them on 2 poles, cleaned and mended, and set it down in front of the Duke of Halstrand, and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. They carried it out to the cocklebank at the next low water, and hung it on a new frame, and it has been lit at the turn of every winter tide since. Her father came in April. He had heard, as such men do, that his daughter had married well after all. Verity received him in the parlour with the covers off, and gave him tea, and listened to 11 minutes of a speech about the trials of a merchant's life, and then said, "There is no money, Papa, my dear girl. There is a pension of £30 a year, settled on Grandmother Carrick for the rest of her life, paid quarterly, in her own name, into her own hands, "And it is not to go through you," said Verity. "That is my husband's doing, and it was done in December before you wrote. Beyond that there is nothing, and there will be nothing, and you may tell the Preston people that the Duchess of Halstrand was very kind and would not be drawn." Josiah Carrick looked at the carpet. "Was he good to you?" he said. "He offered me £40 and a way out on the first afternoon," said Verity. "You should know that. He offered it before he knew anything about me, except that I was standing in his hall in a wet gown, and I have thought about that offer every day since, and I have never once wished I had taken it." Her father went home on the evening water. Gabriel walked him down to the slip and put him in the cart himself, and said something quiet to him that Verity never asked about, and Josiah Carrick wrote to her twice a year after that, and never once mentioned money again. There is a stick rack inside the kitchen door at Ashenholt with 2 poles in it. One is ash, 7 feet, brass ferruled, with 11 notches cut in the top 18 inches by a 19-year-old in the winter of a bad year. The other is newer and shorter and has no notches on it at all, and never will, and it is the one she carries now, because the old one has been hung on the wall of the tower where the drovers can see it. The glove is gone. He put it in the kitchen fire himself on a Tuesday in June, and burnt his good hand doing it, and Verity took that hand out of the ashes and held it up in front of him and said, "You are a very stupid man." And he said, "Yes," and neither of them let go. They keep the crossing. He rings the bell at the turn and she walks the channels, and there is a boy from Kirkgarth learning the poles now who will have it after them, and in 11 years there has not been another notch. And on winter evenings, when the water comes up over the flat, and the brazier is burning out on the cockle bank, and the whole of the Halstrand goes silver and then goes dark, the Duke and Duchess of Halstrand sit on the floor by the kitchen fire with their backs against the settle, and he keeps his ruined hand where she can reach it. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. Tell us which town you are listening from tonight, and whether you would have crossed.